Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric and a continuing series, Castlevania Chronicles, where we review every single mainline Castlevania game ever made in a retrospective fashion. And today we have the one and only entry in the Sega Genesis, and that is Vampire Killer that I'm playing here, also known as Castlevania Bloodlines. And when I say this game is completely different from all the other games we've talked about so far, I genuinely mean it. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell definitely helps us out. If you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But it starts off familiar enough. We enter into Dracula's castle. There's all these fine tapestries and curtains on the walls, and there's zombies down below that we can hit. And this intro feels almost like a remake of some of the original NES games, down to coming down these stairs and finding mermen down here to hunt. But both from a gameplay perspective, a graphical perspective, and most importantly, story perspective, this is unlike any other game that ever came in the franchise up until this point in time. Because this hews closer to Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel, than it does the main storyline for Castlevania. The story in this game is Elizabeth Bartley reanimates Dracula to serve him, and she is loosely based on Elizabeth Bathory's, if you believe the legends, murdered virgins and used their blood to bathe in to keep herself looking younger. Antiquity's not quite sure if that's true or not. It's probably a legend because most things that gruesome are, but hey, you never know. But you'll see right here, I'm playing as Eric Lecard, and that is because if it gives you an option not to use a whip and even doing an entire retrospective with whips, you may as well take that option. But it does change things up dramatically in the gameplay, giving you a high jump and all sorts of other abilities to attack that you're not used to seeing, and honestly that is refreshing. But Bloodlines doesn't get the same acclaim as something like Super Castlevania 4, but I would say genuinely it is as good of a game. Now of course it looks totally different because it's on the Genesis and it's completely different hardware, but what it does really well, and I would say at least for the first boss fight compared to Super Castlevania 4, I much prefer this knight to the skeleton rider, and that is just me personally. I love how this chamber is broken and you have that full moon in the background. It just looks really nice and dramatic, and those rich blood reds on the carpet harken back to the colors that royalty would use. Still not the hardest boss in the game, but I would say that this game gets pretty brutally hard towards the end when you have to get close to fighting Dracula. You're going to get into a boss rush, and I'll show you shortly. But I love what this game does visually. The designers knew that Super Castlevania 4 was acclaimed for all the Mode 7 effects, and they needed to do something to mirror that. But the Genesis didn't have anything like Mode 7, but there was other ways to do trickery with the Genesis or Mega Drive hardware, and this pseudo-reflection here in that undulating water is absolutely spectacular. It is an extremely convincing effect. They even changed the shadowing on the different sprite work to make it look like there's a little bit of water being absorbed there. This game is slow at times, but I kind of like the pacing. On a level like this, it's almost an auto-scroller where the screen's coming up, but you need to stay above the level of that water and you need to be constantly attacking, because if you go underneath it, that is an instant death. Nobody in Castlevania can swim, not even Alucard in Symphony of the Night. You need to get him the power to be able to survive underwater. And you'll see here, Medusa's back, but she's got a completely different look, and this is taking a tour through Europe, and I like that it's actually using real-world locations in that stylized Castlevania way. It's got a certain look and feel and vibe to it that definitely feels like it is wholly original and wholly different, and that is just so much fun. I love the blues. I even love when you're jumping up here, this dude with the mace wearing his helmet, and you knock a head off a statue just so you can continue. There's a lot of high concept items in this game, but the gameplay matches it. All of the movements, everything like that, is just an amazing way to play the game. I love it for what it does. Even the boss fights, they're bigger and just more exciting than Super Castlevania 4. And if you had to ask me, I would say that honestly, I prefer Bloodlines to Super Castlevania 4. I'm sure I'll get some comments down below telling me why that's wrong, but it's just the way I feel. But this game also has a really good soundtrack, even though it does use the Sega Genesis sound chip, which is notorious for not being anywhere near up to par with what the Super Nintendo could pull off. But of course, you're also going to get Flea Man Alley here. You're never not going to get Flea Men. But listen for like 35-45 seconds, and I'll come right back and tell you more about why Castlevania Bloodlines or Vampire Killer is an incredible game. Enjoy! just love that one song right there. It kind of sounds like somebody at Konami did uncredited work with John Carpenter, because it has that same sort of synth horror vibe that some of his movies feature. Definitely different tones, but it has that same sort of ambiance to me. As you go up the Leaning Tower of Pisa here, you get more of those Genesis effects trying to show up the Mode 7 on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and it is highly effective. That tower in the background does look like it is rotating, but if you look at the sprite, you're going to see some lines where that sprite breaks up, and that's how they were able to achieve the effect. It is highly effective. It might not be as clean looking as the Super Nintendo, but what it does is run at full speed when it's happening. Even with this boss fight here, as the tower starts to rotate around, your frame rate is holding up, and that is something that we can't say about Super Castlevania 4. So they definitely had a good handle on how the Genesis hardware worked, although this game came much later in the Genesis hardware life than Super Castlevania 4 did in the Super Nintendo, so it really is kind of hard to compare them directly. But another absolutely epic boss fight that I love in this game. But the game also has a fun sense of humor and playfulness. As we go on to the next stage, Stage 4, this is in a World War I era munitions factory, and there are skeletons with war hats on, basically soldiers' hats, and the soundtrack in this spot, way more Castlevania, so take a listen and enjoy. I mean, for what the Genesis sound chip was able to offer, that sounds absolutely spectacular. I love this area here where that fountain turns to blood, and it's just something you walk through. At this stage here, where you have that nice parallax effect with those dark brooding clouds going over a blood red moon, while you walk in this sort of moon-bathed light of this bridge right here, it just looks incredible. I love it. This game always has a vibe and a mood, but my favorite part of the entire game is the next area, and that is the mirror or refraction room, because suddenly your screen just splits. You're in the foreground, you're in the background, and this to me is still one of the best effects that the Sega Genesis was ever able to pull off, and it is mind-bending when you play this for the first time. It's mind-bending when you play it for the 100th time. The sense of scale and perspective and what's going on in that one room is just something I had never seen in gaming before, and honestly I've never seen something quite like it since. Compared to the upside down room, which changes your control scheme and is quite confusing. Just trying to get up these stairs alone, you really need to flex your brain and understand how to walk up, because it is definitely not an easy thing to do. But we're getting towards the end of the game, and of course it wants you to lose a few more lives, like throwing all of these armor knights at us at the fastest speed possible, just to test your reaction. And that's what you're going to need, fast reaction speed, because the boss rush in this game, which we're coming up onto shortly, is one of the hardest last sections of any Castlevania game I have ever played. But I love that you still walk up those stairs with those fine purple drapes hanging down, and we're going to find an old friend of Castlevania and Dracula up here. Don't want to spoil it quite yet if you never played the game, but that blood moon is going to come in, and it is our old friend Death, and he's basically going to do a refight of a lot of the bosses in the game, and there's one card that gives you a full health up, and if you're really unlucky like me, you're going to pull it off the first one, and the fight's going to be that much harder. But one boss we didn't show you yet is this Gear Clockwork guy. Cannot remember his name, should have looked it up, I think I did, and I forgot when I was doing the voiceover. It just looks really unlike Castlevania, but wildly interesting at the same time. They definitely have a lot less life in the refights than they do in the normal levels. But of course, now that we've gotten through all of Death's cards, we're going to fight the man, the myth, the legend himself, Death. And I do like his appearance in this game with that kind of orange Umbra robe on there, throwing the scythes down at us. It's got a lot of fun vibe to it. And of course, because it's Death, it's not even the final character in the game. That's how powerful Dracula is. He is above Death in the lore of Castlevania, and I do love that. But now that we've gotten by Death, you would be thinking, hey, Dracula must be coming up shortly, and that is in no way, shape, or form the reality of this game, because we have to get to Elizabeth Bentley first. And that's what I mean when I say this is one of the hardest Castlevania games in the 16-bit era, because this game just keeps handing you boss after boss after boss. Do your boss refights, fight Death, fight this character, and then I guess you know who's going to be coming next. But I will say that this fight is probably even harder than Dracula. Not off the first stage, you can kind of stand in the safe zone and almost completely avoid any damage, but when she goes into this orb phase, trying to hit her before she hits you can be maddeningly frustrating, and you really need to learn the patterns. If you beat her on your first attempt, kudos to you, because I could not do it even on this capture. But I love as she dies, her entire torso just explodes and blood comes out. But now that we see that rich blood red, you know who we're going to be fighting. You know him, you love him, the demon from down south, Old Man D, Dracula himself. And I guess if he was a wrestler, that's what it would sound like. Maybe Paul Bearer would be his stage manager. And I would say it's another really fun Dracula fight. He looks a little bit funny and hokey in this one, especially in his final form. I kind of laugh at it more than I think it is horror themed. But in the first form here, you can just kind of tag him with that spear or throw holy water at him. It isn't really that hard to avoid whatsoever. But when you get that last hit on his first stage, he's going to go into stage 2. And I actually like this. Most Dracula fights are only 2 stages long, or 2 cycles. This one has a completely new and 3rd cycle, and this isn't death, it's just another form of Dracula, and he's kind of cool looking with that robe and that scepter that shoots down those balls. Still not the hardest thing in the world to hit though, and once you get him knocked down, he goes into his 3rd and final phase. And like I said, maybe you don't agree with me, but I just think this kind of looks goofy. I'm supposed to be afraid of Dracula, but honestly his final form kind of looks like a rejected design from Jeff Goldblum's The Fly, and his crotch is definitely a mouth. That's just kind of how it goes. Kind of reminds me a little bit of some of the final bosses from the Ghouls and Ghosts franchise. I mean, he flies around, he kind of looks like Beelzebub, but he also kind of makes me laugh just a little bit. But honestly, once you get him towards the ground, he just hops back and forth, and you can completely immune and just tag Dracula until you beat him. But I love that wavy pattern in the background, and when we kill him, I love how the screen kind of plays around and distorts with itself. But that is Castlevania Bloodlines. It's probably the least talked about mainline Castlevania game, and I'm not sure if that's because the storyline is totally different, or if it was just on the Sega Genesis, and this franchise up until this point was pretty much an exclusive Nintendo affair outside the PC Engine. But of course, like every other game we've shown you the ending of, Dracula's castle has to crumble into the earth. I'll have another video on Castlevania next week. I'll have videos the week as well, but if you've never played Bloodlines because it doesn't seem as good as the rest of the Castlevania games, take my word for it is. We'll see you guys next time. Eric's fulfilled his destiny. Bye-bye.